Kamalpreet, you may go.
Oh, thank you, Tina. Welcome to all in the afternoon session, the second last session of the day as well as the conference. The title of this session is Non-Plenary Session 11, Memory and Desire. And the session will be chaired by Dr. Amin Gorgul. Allow me to introduce Dr. Amin Gorgul. She is an associate professor and a tenured faculty of Istanbul Technical University School of Architecture, actively taking part both in graduate and undergraduate levels of architecture and interior architecture programs, and former vice chair of Department of Interior Architecture. She has received her BSc, MSc, and PhD degree from ITU on architecture and architectural theory and criticism. Her master thesis focused on deconstructivism and avant-garde theory while dismantling the AG behavior in deconstructivism. Yet her PhD thesis, entitled Space as a Becoming, a discussion in transfiguring ontology of space and emergence of spatial mediators, also focused on the space as an open-ended dynamic embodiment and examined the architectural space through a delusion context. She was a visiting researcher at Tretyakov Galleries and State Russian Museum, visiting scholar at DSG TU Delft, a visiting teacher at AA Architectural Association London, VTP, and invited studio critic in Hong Kong University School of Architecture. She was also a visiting professor in CADC, Auburn University, Alabama, and guest lecturer in ENSA Versailles. She has been the chair of Deluse Studies Conference Istanbul 2014 and also keynote presenters and camp tutors of many Deluse Studies conferences. She teaches not only design studios but also theoretical courses focusing on architecture theory and criticism, space and politics, gender and space, as well as design culture. She has authored numerous articles and book chapters, both in Turkish and in English. Last but not least, among many other funded research projects, she is the recent winner of Turkey's one of the most prestigious research prizes founded by Koç University and VEKAM with her project entitled Entertainment Policies, Modern Subjectivities and Leisure Cultures, the effect of Chubuk Dam and its casino in Ankara's leisure culture. I would now like to invite Dr. Amin Gogul to please take over.
Good afternoon, Kamal. Thank you so much for this generous introduction of me. But yes, today we're on the final day of this great marathon and the 11th non-plenary session together with fantastic presenters with the topic of memory and desire. So we will have 4 presenters, and initially we'll begin with Dr. Yulia Bonai from Ljubljana with her presentation entitled Crystallization of Time, a Worldly Memory, Sufficient Reason and Desire. Dr. Bonai is a researcher in the field of philosophy of mind, political philosophy, ontology, and psychology. Her PhD thesis is focused on the concept of desire as created by Deleuze and Guattari in the concept of political philosophy. Being as a yoga teacher, she is also a lifelong student of philosophy and psychology of yoga. She's publishing papers regarding the causes of human suffering, researching human abilities of their possible prevention. She's currently working at the Faculty of Arts, Department of Psychology in University of Ljubljana in Slovenia. I would like to hand over to Julia. Over to you, Julia, if you're ready.
Yes, thank you. Hello, hi everyone. I'm
Julia,
do you hear me?
It was
Hello?
interruption. Yes, maybe you can
Hear
turn off your
me?
camera. Maybe it makes things better. Do you think? If you don't stream,
It's not good. The internet connection.
well, if you only stream the voice, then
Is now
it might
okay?
be very rapid. Can you speak one more time so we can check?
I will try. Otherwise, I will connect with the mobile phone. Okay. Is now
I think
better?
this is better. Yes, yes, perfect.
Is it better?
It is better.
Yes.
It is. Yes.
Okay.
Great. Okay.
Now I will do without camera. So I will just begin. Okay. Presentation addresses the relation between human desire and memory from the point of view of the interconnectedness of the whole world. For Deleuze and Guattari, desire is not confined to thoughts, it is personal, subconscious, or even better, by the unconscious of the whole world. This worldly unconscious acts as potential condition of power or desire, as well as the motive of its inclinations. Namely, according to Deleuze and Guattari, desire is not defined by its reference to an external object. Desire is first of all a volition that implies power, causing a volition to act in a particular direction. This power refers to the endeavor or primary acting force defined by the concept of entelechy. With this concept, they do not address merely human desire, but the desire of all living beings, the endeavor of life itself, primarily on the motives of desire, keeping in mind the assumption that the object of desire is not the cause of its psychological conditioning, which extends beyond the personal sphere. According to Deleuze, Leibniz inaugurated the first great phenomenology of motives. He denounced two illusions, I quote. One consists in objectifying motives as if they were weights placed on the pans of a scale, and as if the deliberation were seeking to know in what direction, all conditions being equal, the scale would tip. The other illusion consists in dividing motives, since an infinity of subjective motives are needed so that a choice of objectified motives can be made, as if one might be able to desire. But in truth, end of citation. But in truth, the soul is what invents its own motives, and they are always subjective. Motives, asserts Leibniz, are dispositions of mind, not merely that they cause a particular voluntary action, but they also cause volition to act in a particular way. Besides motives, there are no other dispositions of mind to act by virtue of which it could reject or accept such motives. The concept of desire introduced by Deleuze and Guattari can be compared with Leibniz's concept of volition. In his book, Essays in Human Understanding, Leibniz explains volition as an endeavor, that can be divided into entelechy, primary acting force, and effort, derivative acting force. Every endeavor or volition results in action unless it is prevented. Furthermore, he explains that volition is determined by an important distinction between necessity and determination. In the first case, one is inevitably determined, while in the second, determination is merely potential. Even free beings do not act in an undetermined way, necessity, but because one will is determined in a particular way. That means, in Leibniz's case, that one will is sufficiently independent. Volition is thus potentially determined and motivated by perceptions and appetites, the action or eternal principle that change by perception. The inclinations of the will are determined and motivated either by minute unconscious or inseparable perceptions, by sensible but confused perceptions, and by deistic perceptions that can be apprehended with the help of reason. The first insensible perceptions conditions endeavors to overcome small obstacles. They are constantly present also in those cases in which one appears to be completely indifferent, resulting in the fact that one can never be evenly balanced among different options. The disquiet of these insensible perceptions that drive volition to overcome small obstacles is essential to happiness, asserts Leibniz, as it encourages people toward greater perfection. Present attainment can merely be a cause of joy, but real happiness consists in continual and uninterrupted progress. Thus, insensible perceptions can become a means of continuous improvement as one becomes able to be aware of them and to control them by understanding their causality. This ability has been practiced by yogis throughout known history. Besides perceptions and appetites, there is also another aspect of mind that determines volition, which is described by Leibniz with the concept of monads. They are elements of things or simple substances that have no parts. They differ from each other according to their perception. Monads are also described as entelechies. An entelechy is a primary substantial endeavor, the acting force or power of actualization. The word entelechia comes from a combination of the Greek word that means in and perfection, as the word denotes each entelechy expresses perception. The entelechy that expresses a greater degree of perfection is defined as soul, as it is able to have apperceptions. These are distinct or conscious perceptions. In Indian philosophy, the degrees of perception are explained by the concept of gunas. A guna is mode of the manifestation of the universe that expresses a degree of perfection through a degree of universal consciousness implied in it. The apperception described by Leibniz is one step towards manifestation, implying the highest degree of universal consciousness. Even though they differ according to their ability to perceive, they cannot be explained with perspectivism. As Deleuze explained in his book about Leibniz, The Fault, a soul or a subject occupies a point of view. It is what remains in the point of view and without which the point of view would not exist. But the point of view is part of its potential aspect that is manifested in each case that is occupied by the soul. Explained by Deleuze, a point of view does not express the relativity of truth, as perspectivism would assume, but the truth of relativity. The traces of each perception, including the way they occupy the point of view in the material world, create a memory of the soul that is responsible for its individuation. As Leibniz says, an immaterial being or spirit cannot be stripped of all perception of its past existence. It retains impressions of everything which has previously happened to it, and it even has presentiments of everything which
Julia, we lost you. Julia? Is it me or Julia? Is it me?
Yes, we seem to have lost her.
Okay.
Yes, yeah.
Okay, then yeah, we lost Julia.
I'm here.
Okay.
She's
Hello,
back.
do you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, but there are sometimes minor
Did you hear me before?
interruptions.
It was okay.
We were just left when you explained Leibniz
Interruptions?
perspective and the relativity. Then we lost you. It's broken when you were saying. I mean, it's interrupted when you were saying the relativity point. Okay.
I might change the. I will try to change the connection. I need just a few seconds.
Okay. Maybe
I will connect to my mobile phone and I will try. Maybe it will be better. connection. Just a moment. Okay, do you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, but if you keep on talking, then we can understand if it's going to interrupt it.
Okay. I will continue. The traces of each perception, including the way they occupy the point of view in the material world, create a memory of the soul that is responsible for its individuation. As Leibniz says, I quote, an immaterial being or spirit cannot be stripped of all perception of its past existence. It retains impressions of everything which has previously happened to it, and it even has presentiments of everything which will happen to it. But these states of mind are mostly too minute to be distinguishable, and for one to be aware of them, though they may grow someday. It is this continuity and interconnection of perceptions which makes someone the same individual. But our awareness, that means when we are aware of past states of mind, proves a moral identity, as well as resides in the fact that each monad implies in itself the implicit order of the entire universe. I quote, as a result, everybody is affected by everything that happens in the universe to such an extent that he who sees all can read in each everything what happens everywhere, and even what has happened, what will happen, by observing in the present what is remote in time as well as in space. End of quotation. The whole world is incarnated monad, but the monads or soul of the world, which each different perception, a soul influences the whole world, and as such it is incarnated in each of them in a different way. Quote, the word must be placed in the subject in order that the subject can be for the word. End of quotation. Thus, every exists as a potential condition of volition or desire, or in other words, every actual act of desire or volition implies in itself the virtual sphere of worthy memory. The past of the whole world, which is described by Bergson as a pure present, is described by Deleuze in his book Cinema 2, where he refers to Bergson's explanation of memory. This is from the book Matter and Memory, Bergson's book. The virtual dimension contains the potential of everything that is actualized and the way it is actualized. Thus, every actuality has its own potentiality or virtual sphere, composed of more or less contracted circuits, each of them representing a wholeness of recollections that form a coin with its point immersed in the actual present. This virtual sphere represents explained as pure and changes completely with its actualization. Consequently, each different mode or inclination of desire changes the conditions of its potential actualization. Furthermore, Deleuze explains that virtuality, which envelops every actuality, is the past that coexists and is contemporaneous with the actual present. The present passes, or that means that is no more, while the past has ontological meaning as it is and it exists. Moreover, he further clarifies how the virtual and the actual merge together in the subject or object. while this merging consolidates in a crystalline structure in the crystallization of time. What can be seen in the crystal is a time that is split at each moment as present past. Thus, each crystal aspect, the limits of every actuality, and the vast crystallizable universe of virtuality. Everything were a frozen seed, namely, each crystal is infinite. It is always in the process of being made with the seed that incorporates the environment and forces it to crystallize. Discernible but distinct components of the crystal in relation of mutual predisposition. I quote from the last, the one which will crystallize an environment which is at present amorphous. But on the other hand, the latter must have a structure in each incorporation of the environment. The less asks himself how to multiply those entrances, but not just quantitatively, but also qualitatively. There are different kinds of entrances: geographical, psychic, psychological, physical, historical, archaeological, etc. For the crystal as a whole is only the ordered set of its seeds or the transversal of words that are incorporated in the actual present are described by the philosophy of yoga as samskaras or vasanas. Samskaras are traces or impressions of every experience of an individual during his lifetime and in the course of his past lives, whilst vasanas are latent tendencies created by these traces. Namely, both are part of subtle body that accompanies the soul after death. This assumption was also made by Leibniz. I quote, on my hypothesis, souls are not indifferent to any parcel of matter, as it seems to you that they are. On the contrary, they inherently express those they best impulses, and they had any perception in the old one. And indeed, the new body would have to feel the effects of it. So there will always be real marks on the continuance of the individual. End of quote. The past impressions condition human perception and act as motives for one's volition. As virtuous seeds, they lie dormant in the unconscious mind, chitta, but can become actualized when the person encounters the environment or circumstances that trigger them. Yoga presents various techniques or practices that enable a person to eliminate harmful samskaras in order for them not to be repeated again in different times or circumstances as a concept of karma or samsara denote. As for Deleuze and Leibniz, passing changes the future aspect of all yoga knowledge that was created by sages in the past. This yoga technique consists of merging with the universal consciousness that permits matter in different degrees. In this state of higher consciousness, called samadhi, one can influence and change matter and thus dissolve the harmful imprints of the past. As proclaimed by Patanjali, the removal of samskaras results in the removal of kleshas. These are the 5 main causes of human suffering. This is subjective, universal consciousness that penetrates material world in different ways, acts as sufficient reason for every manifestation, information, and motives. Leibniz to describe the same ontological error, assuming that it presents a perfect state of consciousness or awareness. This state of perfect force, there is an infinity of past forces that act as a sufficient cause for present actualization, as a potential. whether all these sets of causes and degrees of perfection regarding the different degrees of universal consciousness or God in Leibniz terms implied in them. According to Indian philosophy, when a soul is able to connect itself to the perfection of universal consciousness that is potentially implied or infinity, changes the past as well as the future. As it changes the causes of worldly memory, also changes the acts that are implied in them. Asian yoga, as described by Patanjali, represents a most efficient practice that helps the living being to connect to the self with skeptics, or universal path to gain. The path to gain a higher degree of consciousness is the ability to gain distinct perceptions or knowledge of causes, especially those we are not aware of. The degree of express not merely how particular culture deals with problems, but more importantly, how to define them. In the most people not. Yes, do you hear me?
Sorry to interrupt. Yes, last 3 minutes, please.
Last 3 minutes. Okay, I will do very quick. Okay. Yes, this is the last page. In the past, most people were not aware of the interconnectedness of the whole world. Therefore, they defined myths, they defined the problems through the assumption of positions. There is presupposed evil incarnated in a being, group, or culture which is supposedly separated from or has nothing to do with the goodness on the other side of such positions. As every possible solution is already implied in the definition of a problem, the solution of the problem can be arrived at by destroying the incarnation of evil, which is normally done by the hero. But contemporary myths are more aware of the interconnectedness of everything that is in the universe. This can be seen in new stories told to children. I selected story Frozen 2 as representative of the phenomenon of the change in the perspective and definition of the problem, but in this case, the change concerns the whole world and it's not a particular culture. This story is not merely a culture that has become a story that constitutes an important collective of the self or other. The whole problematically changes in function and quality of our souls. The source of the problem is not repeated from what is supposed to be good, but is implied in the past that concern the whole community. The only one who is able to drown the past. But this river betrayed become frozen sculptures. When she finally comes to discover her grandfather responsible for killing the native innocent people in the forest. That means that she was, as a descendant, also part of the problem, even though at first glance it seems that she was approaching.
Julia, I think we truly lost you at this moment. You're still there?
Hello.
Yes.
Yeah, thought everything went off and then I have to disconnect again. So I need 2 minutes more, if that's okay?
Yes, we shorten the Q&A, but make sure that it's just 2 more minutes. The connection is seems like poor, and so coming with a delay. Okay.
Quick conclusion.
Okay,
I will skip.
Go ahead. Yes.
Okay.
Please go ahead.
Okay. Okay. The problem. Okay. She was Senate also part of the problem, even though at first she was approaching the problem as its solution. In this moment of recognition, she becomes a frozen sculpture among other collective memory traces. She becomes a memory. This problem was later resolved by her sister. As a result of her sister's recent endeavors, she also becomes acquainted with the hidden past. Therefore, she decided to demolish a dam, which was first been given by her grandfather to the neighbor as gift. But this present, or the dam, was merely a delay course that led to the killing of innocent people. In so doing, she released her sister Ilsa from the frozen crystalline structure or collective memory. Both sisters were able to trust with the knowledge or awareness of the causes and with their consequent response to knowledge. In so doing, they changed the degree of consciousness or perfection, enabling a new better way of actualization for the whole of the community. The change in the degree of consciousness in material substance is also the degree of life, or in Leibniz's words, the degree of the metaphysical component implied in the physical world. That was more profoundly described by Deleuze in his last essay, Immanence Life. Creating new entrances in the crystalline structures, applying new crystalline seeds, or living crystalline thus opening the future. All these are the means of creating a new past that conditions the possible actualization of the present. As Deleuze states in this sense, I quote, the past which is preserved all takes on all new virtues of beginning and beginning again. It is what holds in step besides the search of the new reality, the burning of life. Thank you very much. I hope
Thank you
that no?
Thank you so much, Julia. It has been interrupted.
Did you hear anything?
No, we did. We did.
Hear?
At least I did. I tried to take my notes.
Okay.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Valuable
Thank
reading
you.
of the notions of memory, perception, mutuality from diverse perspectives, where you made a sort of a cross reading through Indian rituals and concepts. I have been informed a lot. Thank you so much, at least for my part, and I'm sure everybody has a similar experience. I would like to pursue with the second presentation. Professor Stanya Devisan Nambiar from University of Delhi, the assistant professor in Department of English, Jesus and Mary College, University of Delhi. She studied English literature and philosophy at Lady Shri Ram College, again in University of Delhi, and Jawaharlal Nehru University. Her doctoral thesis was an exploration of conceptual structures in continental philosophy and Deleuzian modes of philosophical thought in particular. I would like to welcome Professor Devisan with her paper entitled Territoriality in the Anthropocene, Deleuze and Memory, and Deleuze and Plenary Thinking. Sorry, I'm just being interrupted, some Turkish words just behind the door, so sorry for the mispronunciations. Over to you, Sandia. So good to see you all again.
It's so good to see you. I mean, I think the pandemic has done its bit and kept us all away from each other, and I've been really missing everyone. So it's really good to see you and all the friends here, and I'm really grateful for this opportunity to present what are extremely jumbled thoughts on the topic. I must apologize at the outset because my paper has very little to do with memory and desire. It was a late edition, and I think Manoj had to do some real juggling here to kind of include it at the last minute. So it got pushed into the session. I'm glad that I'm here in the session with you, Amin, but it may not fit the larger theme of this panel, and for which I profusely apologize. So I'll begin my paper, The Territoriality in the Anthropocene, Delis and Planetary Thinking, by invoking the concept of the clinamen of the body, as Jason Smith theorizes in his introduction to Franco Berardi's The Soul at Work, and where the clinamen is thought of as a particular tendency, or what Deleuze would perhaps call hekayety, of the body as gravity, falling towards and in with other bodies. And I quote, "The materialist tradition represented by Epicurus and Lucretius proposed a worldless time in which bodies rain down through the plumbless void, straight down and side by side, until a sudden, unpredictable deviation or swerve, clinamen leans bodies towards one another so that they come together in a lasting way. The soul does not lie beneath the skin. It is the angle of this swerve and what then holds these bodies together. It spaces bodies rather than hiding within them. It is among them, their consistency, the affinity they have for one another. It is what they share in common, neither a form nor something, or nor something, but a rhythm, a certain way of vibrating, a resonance, frequency, tuning, or tone." I find this conceptualization quite Deleuzian, especially where it speaks of affinity between bodies leading to a certain resonance. Smith goes on to state, "Capitalism is the mobilization of a pathos and the organization of a mood. It is its subject, a field of desire, a point of inflection for an impersonal affect that circulates like a rumor. The cognitariat carries a virus." Thinking about DNG's geophilosophy, especially as a response to capital's insistence on the private, and especially in the contemporary thinking of the private as only property, as not only property, but the private practices of the anthropos, or the private as a particular organization, which in one sense is already indicated in Guattari's three ecologies, as the massive structuration or organization of the planet, thought, sentiment, and life into privately owned technological circulations, as well as carrying its autoimmunity, as Derrida would call it, as virological potential. The virus then, in its materiality and its metaphor, presents to us fundamentally the crisis of organization against disorganization or chaos, and the problem of naming the crisis as such. And of course, this presents a challenge in terms of knowing or creating the refrain as concept, which Ian had focused on in his plenary lecture in this conference, and which Deleuze recognizes as the very task of philosophy. One of the forms of naming the crisis as the Anthropocene, of course, focuses on the anthropos as the field of contestation, especially where in its critical move away from the previous investments of the anthropos within power to recognizing anthropocenic responsibility in planetary dissimulation and destruction. The new organizations of life or planet in crisis therefore require a move away from historic methods of naming to new insurgent concepts and vocabularies that deterritorialize older images of a planet subordinated to the anthropos. I use this idea of insurgency in its urgent call to transgress the enclosure of the body in thought, where it displaces the body in its various forms as sensory materiality, or body as state, or the body of the planetary itself. The naming of the crisis in the contemporary presents a crucial problem, where existence as we know it has been fundamentally changed, and its vectors operate beyond our control. Returning to the question that Deleuze poses, what is grounding for something, and where he goes on to say something new is produced in the unveiled mind. This is from his seminar on grounding. Something new is produced in the unveiled mind. What is unveiled is the veritable structure of the imagination, to wit, the sense which cannot be understood except by and in the enterprise of grounding, which, far from presupposing a point of view of the infinite, is one and the same as the principle of the imagination. To these aims, one could ask, what is the concept of the Anthropocene for? And of course, there are many competing terms that attempt to theorize it from different perspectives, as Andrew Refkin points out, and he says whether it's the greed-driven capitalocene, the trash-choked plastocene, the combustible pyrocene, the self-loathing misanthropocene, the testosterone-dominated manthropocene, even the obscene. And Donna Haraway, of course, goes on to say, all the 1,000 names are too big and too small. All the stories are too big and too small. And one of the questions that perhaps could be asked here, and of course these are political questions, are who are the people that they impact? And if the Anthropocene is the scene of a longue durée crime, then on whom does the final responsibility of this crime or criminal act rest? In their persuasive chapter titled Who is the Anthropos? From the book The Shock of the Anthropocene, Bonnier and Friso cites the example of the Yanomami Indians who hunt, fish, and garden in the Amazonian forest, working 3 hours a day with no fossil fuel, to ask the question, should they feel responsible for the climate change of the Anthropocene? What is this Anthropos, the generic human being of the Anthropocene, they ask, talking about humanity as one abstract entity with one total impact obscures the vast differences in environmental footprint and carbon footprint. It buries colonial histories, racism, and climate justice, describing a humanity that is uniformly involved and, as it implies, uniformly to blame. This immediately then makes the questions of the Anthropocene, of course, as much a political question as an ecological one. Or to cut things short, a question of ecological survival is a question of political survival. And for us, the children of the age, the question is always of politics, as Wisława Szymborska informs us. Donna Haraway points to this challenge of naming itself and gives us at least 4 different ways of thinking through it in Anthropocene, Capitalocene, Plantationocene, Cthulhucene, making kin. And she says, I think the issues about naming relevant to the Anthropocene, Plantationocene, or Capitalocene have to do with scale, rate or speed, synchronicity, and complexity. At the level of scale, we are now brought to thinking at the scalar properties and magnitude of objects that make up the world, and rethinking or reprioritizing their existence and their coexistence along with the Anthropos. Part of this challenge, of course, is that of subjectivity itself and the impossibility of articulating difference through the other. However, the nomination of our times as anthropocenic and events such as the pandemic perform a new and in some cases a soteriological operation. It displaces the historical relationship of the world and the human, turning it away from privatized excavation to either investing it with scalar messianicity, the planetary as Mother Earth, as Gaia, as a thing that will save us, or of course denialism, which is quite prevalent, or a form of thinking that brings forth a new body and new image of thought, where the skin of the world is understood differently, the body not as enclosure, but as a nomadic threshold of cross-pollinating entities, the virus not as an external pathogen that attacks another healthy organism, but a relationship between scales of porousness, one perhaps performing a minority operation within a larger one. In his essay entitled Care, Tom Van Duren points to another way of thinking about this world and our place in it outside the politics of fatality and as a vital practice of critique. And I quote, I have often felt over the past 7 years or so like I am on an extended journey along the edge of extinction. I have spent time sitting among albatrosses engaged in courtship and nesting. I have dressed up like a whooping crane to interact with young birds learning a lost migratory route. I have helped to provide enrichment for captive Hawaiian crows, hiding dead mice inside green rubber balls in their aviaries to challenge and stimulate them. All of these birds are members, more accurately participants of species that are in decline or in serious trouble. Spending time in these spaces has prompted me to think about ethics through concepts like witness, hope, and inheritance. Through these experiences, I have also begun to appreciate an important role for care in all of its ambiguity and complexity. What does it mean to care for others at the edge of extinction? What forms might careful scholarship take at this time? In this inversion of nominal categories, the Anthropocene, in fact, is a precursor to what Deleuze had talked about, people always being a creative minority, inverting the scale of thought itself, displacing the Anthropos from its terminal velocity of light. Which brings us to Haraway's next formulations that are speed, synchronicity, and complexity, which can also all be reimagined anew. I have been thinking of themes, the image of themes, and maybe here I can present an image. Just a second. Right. As borders, the seams of textiles, or seams as limits, as something giving way, a straining at the edges, as also the rich subterranean mineral veins of the earth turned into instrumental resource by capital, of course, but which can be seen within the larger assemblage of geologic processes combining with the human into a mechanic phylum, one of which can be understood in the metaphor of the cyborg employed by Haraway. The seam then is the limit, whereas Earth, it is also a form of immanence that produces rhizomatic networks, such as what we see in Suzanne Simard's. Let me see if I can share this as well. Okay, I don't think that's working, but Suzanne Simard's work on mycorrhizal fungi that have been understood as a form of communication, contrary to the traditional idea of trees as a total image, contained within the notion of ecological networks being slower and less complex than technological ones. Her work shows how different varieties of trees and plants depend on fungal networks for carbon resource and information in exchange for sugars and enzymes in a massive rhizomatic system or network. I'm sorry, I didn't want to use the word system. She and her colleagues also found that trees recognize kin connected to them via the mycorrhizal network and shuttle more resources to their own progeny than to unrelated plants. Later in an interview, she says, as I knelt beneath that white bark pine, staring at its root tips, it occurred to me that my whole life I had never really understood what a tree was. At best, I'd been aware of just one half of a creature that appeared to be self-contained, but was in fact legion, a chimera of bewildering proportions. One could go so far now to reformulate the Deleuzian distinction between arboreality and the rhizome to imagine new configurations of the model where arboreality is a problem of anthropocentric visuality. That is, the tree is simply a part of vast subterranean organic assemblages of communication, resource, and cooperation, and perhaps fashion a hitherto incomprehensible form of the planetary and at once molecular thinking into existence. I'm thinking here of Deleuze's 1977 dialogue, where he says, the desert or experimentation on oneself, which is our only identity, our single chance for all combinations that inhabit us, and which perhaps is a way of thinking, a way of perhaps thinking about the virus or new forms or the new forms of life that we now have to live with and find ourselves having to cooperate with in many ways. And the pandemic itself has given us new ways and new spaces of existence, which hitherto seemed impossible. The way of living through the lockdown and in differently imagined families or communities, and undertaking a very different kind of community work, along with the kind of protests and the kind of defenses that was already happening before the pandemic struck, especially in India, where we had spaces like Shaheen Bagh, and which were taken up by the protesters protesting against a certain kind of new borderization and a new kind of citizenship or rules of citizenship imposed by the state, and which I had in a previous conference kind of termed graded citizenship, and taking off from Ambedkar's idea of graded inequality. And all of these forms of thinking of the inside versus the outside, and interiorities versus exteriorities, and citizenships and belongings and the membrane between things and communities, and perhaps to reformulate And of course, all of that work of the protest, all of that work of resistance was stalled by this kind of by the pandemic, by the coronavirus, which struck, and which all of which now is coming together in what is perhaps incomprehensible, but of course new novel ways of moving forward and becoming with, rather than one form of resistance or one form of thinking of the community. And so in the interview with Negri, Delio says, we've got to hijack speech. Creating has always been something different from communicating. The key thing may be to create vacuoles of non-communication, circuit breakers, so we can elude control. This call to planetary thinking then is at once the naming of an intensity, as much a critique of historic modes of power, totalizing images of thought, and of the enclosure, whether as state, whether as society, state, or family, and instead new forms of thought, which involve a breaking out of the walled enclosure as pretext for JCBs and making for the trees. In other words, a wilding of subjectivity that recalls, of course, Anna Singh's feral biologies, but also feral vocabularies, subjectivities, and technologies. Returning to the formulation of the refrain as a way of bringing territory into being, the refrain of the Anthropocene could possibly be a phenomenon or the encounters, rencontre of new bodies, fungi, trees, technologies, mineral themes, minor literatures, cyborgs, and phylums falling anew into each other. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's super mind-opening, and we have a generous review of the concept, literatures, and being informed about current conditions from your side. Thank you so much. We'll have further questions or remarks maybe on the Q&A session. And I would like to pursue with the third presenter after thanking to Professor Devi-Sam. Dr. Bau, Roshni Bau, is our third presenter with the paper titled Rupture and Argumentativism in the Vedanta Sutras of Narayana Guru. Dr. Bau received her PhD in philosophy for a thesis titled Introspective Metaphysics in Colonial India, Transcendental Philosophy of Krishna Ahandra Bhattacharya in 2018 from the Indian Institute of Technology, Bombay, India. Her papers have appeared in Sophia and JICPR, both from Springers, among others. She received her master's degree in history and philosophy of science from the University of Leeds, and presently her research focuses on technological thinking and post-colonial Indian milieu. While she's currently working as an independent scholar, earlier she taught as assistant professor at the Department of Art in Manipur University, Jaipur. So over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Em. Thank you for your kind introduction. And hello to everyone. And before I begin, I extend my warm congratulations to the Dilus and Gathari India Collective. I appreciate the hard work that goes into bringing this event annually, extending this platform to people across the world, and consistently without losing rigor. I really appreciate the effort that goes into this to each member of this collective. And so now coming to my paper, this the seeds of this paper go way back and to the year perhaps 2018, when I got an invitation to discuss a book that was recently published by Nisar Ahmad. And but then it gradually developed limbs, the Luzon-Gatarian limbs, since past 1 year. And that was also my first experience with the Luzon-Gatari collective. And so I'm really glad that I'm able to share my reflections, which I've been developing in the past 1 year on the same platform. And so without much ado, I begin my paper. The paper is titled Structure of Argumentative Reason in the Vedanta Sutras of Narayana, Phenomenon of Vedanta. The so-called argumentative traditions contained in Indian past assume particular significance in the interpretation of Vedanta contained by the Brahma Sutras of Badarayana and in the major commentaries and sub-commentaries that sprang from it, emerging as major schools of Vedanta, namely Advaita, Vishishtadvaita, and Dvaita. In recent times, Amartya Sen's work titled The Argumentative Indian attributes significance to this tradition, deriving its rationale from gaining the importance it assumes in the promulgation of democratic discourse in India as well as across the globe. As multiculturalism shoulders the fabric of social sphere in the future of globalizing world, argumentative reasoning dons the role of integrative force that could potentially suture the diverse cultural and religious sensibilities. Given this understanding of the resourcefulness of the Indian logical and argumentative traditions, Narayana Guru's departure from Badarayana's argumentative style of presenting Upanishadic wisdom in his work Brahma Sutras and the commentarial tradition it thus ensured might appear puzzling to the secular mind. Whether one could situate Narayana Guru's novel interpretation of Vedantic wisdom, couched in a non-argumentative style within the commentarial tradition without thereby making the assumed slippage into the religiously dogmatic one, is the objective of this inquiry. Marshalling insights from other works of Narayana Guru, focusing on freeing Vedantic notion of knowledge, which in Malayalam is given the term Arivu, from caste-ridden divisions of human mind ingrained in the transcendental stages of realization of the absolute, this paper will make a claim for a novel understanding of knowledge, which in Narayana Guru's terminology becomes Arivu, that re-articulates the plane of immanence instituted by Vedanta. Narayana Guru's rendition of Vedanta Sutras, though composed in Sanskrit, significantly alludes to the pre-Vedic times. Whether Deleuze and Guattari's notion of pre-conceptual plane of immanence lends itself to a philosophical understanding of pre-Vedic times that spills its imageries of anti-caste sensibility in Narayana Guru's work, is the question that I'm pursuing in this paper. Defining the texture of fragmentary wholes that philosophical concepts constitute, Deleuze and Guattari in their work titled What is Philosophy underscore that it could be understood better as a phenomenon, or in other words, the plane of immanence of concepts. The difficulty in understanding the nature of plane of immanence arises from the fact that there are varied and distant planes of immanence that we come across in his work. Though the philosophical task of creation of concepts populate itself on the plane of immanence, the latter, by that count, is not pre-existent to philosophy. Rather, it takes root side by side the creation of concepts. Making sense of the laying out of the plane of immanence implies a sort of groping experimentation. Otherwise, the barely perceptible plane of immanence is palpable only through the dangers or the risks that it provokes. Plane of immanence being the internal conditions of creation of concepts, thinking this pre-philosophical plane belong to the order of dreams. of pathological processes, esoteric experiences, drunkenness, and excess. Given this characterization of pre-philosophical plane of immanence bordering the dangerous zones of thinking, it makes more sense to elucidate the deterritorializing nature of this plane, which is manifest in Narayana Guru's departure from the preordained modes of understanding Vedanta to provoke a discontinuity from the prevalent argumentative reasoning, which was given the terminology Purva Paksha. This paper discusses the institutive features of this pre-philosophical plane that deterritorializes the determinable realm of caste, which is a short aphorism written by Narayana Guru, which in Malayalam would read Jati Nirnay. Narayana Guru achieves this feat with the creation of the concept of knowledge, Arivu, which provokes the prevalent concept of Brahman to a relative disuse or of no direct relevance to Narayana Guru's thinking. The philosophical concept Narayana Guru creates in this work, giving it the terminology knowledge, which ought to be distinguished from an analogous term which usually we come across in the Vedantic rendition of the highest level of consciousness of Brahman called wisdom. Whether an exposition of this concept is in tune with the notion of planomenon will render visible the plane of infinity that this concept institutes for an appreciation of anti-caste sensibility inherent to his Vedanta Sutras. As we know, the Deleuzian notion of immanence is grounded in an ontology of difference as opposed to an ontology of identity that urges us to conform to the pre-existent ideal forms of truth. Deleuze and Guattari's articulation of the conceptual plane of immanence that we come across in the work What is Philosophy is the culmination of Deleuze's earlier works on Spinoza, Bergson, and Nietzsche. In his work Expressionism in Philosophy, which is on Spinoza, Deleuze gives vitality to the notion of immanence by juxtaposing it with the lifeless categories associated with the concept of transcendence, under which immanence was subsumed. Motive of transcendence dominated the history of philosophy, modeled after the Judeo-Christian tradition in the West, and after the concept of Brahman in the East, or in particular India. Philosophical thought in pursuit of transcendence bestows upon philosophers the halo of selective representatives who are assigned with the task of delivering insights on truth. Deleuze institutes the concept of difference as a security measure to check philosophical thinking from lapsing into identitarian notions of transcendence. As Todd May argues, a philosophy of transcendence requires at least two ontological substances. These two types of beings presuppose God. These two types of being presupposed are God and the world. Since God transcends the world, it cannot be made of the same substance as the world. Substance or matter that make the world is made of infinite and is of fleeting existence. God is in contrast infinite and eternal. The transcending power is held to be superior to the world it transcends. This superiority of transcending powers is imposed upon the world. It emanates from its constitutive powers or causal powers. During high modernity of the Enlightenment period, when Kant relinquished God from the discursive space of knowledge, human mind occupied the space assigned for transcendental powers of constitutive reasoning. In Krishnachandra Bhattacharya, who was one of the prominent Indian thinkers, Indian intellectuals of the colonial period, doing his work in philosophy, and especially an Advaitic Vedantin following the tradition of Samskaras Advaita, who is arguably the quintessential Indian philosopher of anti-colonial modernity, we find this transcendental powers being transferred further into the interiority of the self, called manas, associate of the passive faculty of sensibility bestowed with the function of unity of a perception. Nonetheless, the transcendence of superior grades of consciousness is the underlying thread of Shankara's line of Advaitic thinking, which culminates in the neo-Advaitic vision of the colonial period. As Todme underscores, superior and inferior grades of consciousness or knowledge is not a requirement of logic, as it is not contradictory to say that the transcending substance is of the same type as the transcendent substance. Rather, it is the modality in which the role of transcendence is assimilated into the history of philosophy that we see being refuted by Deleuze thinking. As Todme highlights, what concerned Deleuze is what is denigrated under the dictates of transcendence: physicality, chaos, difference, or that which restricts identity. It is this quest for the elimination of gradations within consciousness or knowledge of the self and its relation to Brahman that distinguishes Narayana Guru's line of interpretation of Vedanta Sutras from the hierarchical renditions of philosophy of transcendence implied by the post-Shankarite Vedantic systems ensued from the Brahma Sutras of Badarayana, and which brings out resonances with Deleuze and Guattari's notion of immanence. Now I'm coming to Narayana Guru's own interpretation of Vedanta Sutras to highlight the point that I'm trying to make in this paper. Narayana Guru participates in the Vedantic tradition by acknowledging the predetermined objective of Vedantic tradition in his first sutra, which states, "I am Brahman," by affirming the unity of the self and Brahman. But in the second sutra, he objectifies this knowledge by proceeding to define the characteristics of self-knowledge on Brahman, by considering the standpoints from which one could possibly properly arrive at a definition. In the third sutra, he provides the definition of this self-knowledge, that its chief characteristic is effulgence. Knowledge of Brahman is self-luminous. It is of the essence of light, and hence shines forth without an external aid. The third sutra thus clearly dispenses with the methodical steps involved in the realization of Brahman that we see in other revivals of Advaita Vedanta of this period, for instance, in the work of Krishna Chandra Bhattacharya. In the fourth sutra, Narayana Guru denies a place for causal theories of origin in his interpretation of self-knowledge. By being self-luminous in nature, our knowledge of Brahman illuminates the world and the reality around us in the same instant. It is crucial to delineate the theory of causality and creation implicit in the concept of effulgence. As Muni Narayana Prasad, one of his major commentators, or in fact, he's the only commentator from his close associates, because this particular work titled Vedanta Sutras was of a very late discovery. So he's the commentator of Narayana Guru's Vedanta Sutra. As Muni Narayana Prasad makes explicit in his commentary, on the one hand, Narayana Guru conceives Atman as a passive substance that undergoes the beginningless and endless cyclic process without undergoing any change. It is an unborn being which appears in the changing phases of life. Narayana Guru explains in his Darshanamala, I quote, that which causes the 6 phases, existence, birth, growth, transformation, decline, and dissolution, is none other than the actionless self. End of quote. In this respect, this theory of unchanging self subscribes to the causal theory of Vivartavada, which states that cause appearing as effect is without any corresponding intrinsic change. However, its remarkable difference from the prevalent version of Vivartavada adopted by the Shankara school of Vedanta is in the denial of illusoriness of the existent world. This affirmation of life's actualities would then make it susceptible to a misconstrual of his theory of causation as akin to Parinamavad, which postulates a gradual emergence of the world and its life forms through transformations of the original cause, Atman. This is the point where, as Muni Narayana Prasad underscores, Narayana Guru's Vedantic theory of causality breaks away from the prevalent Vedantic wisdom unambiguously. It is in order to illuminate the creative impulse of the self through its forms of expression as manifesting itself as life forms and the world that Muni Narayana Prasad employs the term Yugapat Srishti, which denotes the meaning of instantaneous creation that manifests in a manner of appearance of the world at the moment of waking from sleep. Narayana Guru expresses this view in his Darshanamala. I quote, "Not at all from the sun by stages did the world come to be, but appeared all at once from the self, instantaneously, as if by its own vision on waking from deep sleep." End of quote. If we read this statement through Deleuzian lens, this is what becomes of Deleuzian reading of expressionism in Spinoza. In the fifth sutra consolidates this argument by stating that the existent world can be regarded as appearance only in the sense that the luminous world of appearances exists as an expression of the self-effulgent Atman. This world can also be regarded as non-existent or unreal by looking upon its transitory forms as forms assumed by one pervasive substance called Atman. However, as Muni Narayana Prasad would highlight, the immense variety of forms assumed by Atman are only sparkings of the self-effulgent self. Now, coming to the conclusion of this paper, in his work titled Arivu, that is knowledge, Narayana Guru compares the self-luminosity of knowledge to the nature of fire. Now, quickly coming to his work on caste, the question for us would be to seek an answer about the manner in which this self-luminosity fires up our understanding of the creative dimension of knowledge of caste. If we remind ourselves of the discussion we had in the beginning upon the non-conformist series in Vedantic thinking that Narayana Guru inaugurates, what strikes at the outset about this short aphorism titled Determining Caste or Determination of Caste, which in Malayalam would be titled Jati Nirnaya, is its reference to a new creative series that Parai, a lower caste woman, gives birth to, and another series begun by a fisherwoman. I quote, "In bygone days of Paraya woman, the great sage Parasara was born, as even he of Vedic aphorism fame, of a virgin of the fisher folk." End of quote. Which if paraphrased, would mean to say that Parashara is said to be the author of the epics Mahabharata and Bhagavad Gita, considered among the canonical texts of Vedanta. The second reference is to the sage Vyasa, mentioned in the Genesis chapters of the Puranas as being born of a fisher maiden. How do we make sense of this luminous insight sparking non-conformist anti-caste series as indicative of determination of caste? To conclude my paper, both the Neo-Vedantic schools, those who followed the path of methodic exposition, as well as those who were non-Methodists, such as the commentarial tradition commentated by Narayana Guru's work, refer to Upanishadic wisdom, which is in a way Vedantic sutras were commentarial renditions of Upanishadic wisdom. This is what is believed by all the Vedantic schools. They only differ to the extent that how do we render the Upanishadic wisdom. The Upanishadic wisdom in a sorry, I read the sentence again. Both the Neo-Vedantic schools, those who follow the path of methodic exposition, as in the case of Krishnachandra Bhattacharya, as well as those who were non-Methodists, such as the case of Narayana Guru and his commentary and his commentators, refer to Upanishadic wisdom in a prehistorical sense. In both these schools, Neo-Vedanta emerged as an argument against the digressive phase or degenerative phase of Vedanta, as it gets reflected in theological renditions of the devotional schools of Vaishnavism and Shaivism of the medieval period. Or alternatively, it refers to the degenerative phases of heterodoxy itself, such as in the case of Buddhism. There are several senses in which one could make sense of the concept pre-philosophical. Pivotal question is how to transcend the commonsensical understanding of this term as temporal precedence, as in prehistorical or pre-degenerative or pre-political, the senses in which it appears in Neo-Vedanta. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Just in time, Dr. Babu. Because we need to finish the session in like 25 minutes. Perfect. For my part, I have acknowledged a lot about perception and appreciation of knowledge, and I really like the term self-luminosity and the process of being nurturing, so to say, maybe. So we'd like to pursue with the fourth presenter. Thank you so much one more time. Gopika Mohan would be our fourth presenter today with the paper entitled War Machine. Gopika Mohan hails from Kerala, India. She pursued her BE and master degree in political science from University of Delhi. Graduated with honors in the bachelor's. She has qualified for assistant professorship under DGSIC in India. She's currently looking forward to pursue a doctorate program. Her research areas include gender studies, social exclusion, environmental politics, among others. During her postgraduate years, she has worked on War Machine of Toulouse and Guattari, social exclusion practices of colorism in India society, and survey report on climate change in Delhi as part of her college submissions. Outside of academics, she enjoys drawing, traveling, and exploring different cultures. And over to you, Gopika. Meanwhile, Dr. Julia Bonai sent her presentation paper on the chat, so you can download it through there. Due to the interruptions during her presentation, she has believed that it would be fruitful to expand the exchange realm. Yes.
Good afternoon. We got disconnected in the middle, so.
Okay, no worries. Over to you. I've already read.
Hi, my name is Gopika Mohan, and I'm grateful to Deleuze and Guattari India Collective for presenting this opportunity where I can present my paper. So I'd like to present my paper with the help of slides. So I'm sharing my screen right now. So my paper is about War Machine, as discussed by Deleuze and Guattari in Thousand Plateaus, and understanding the farmers' protest that is going on in India right now as a war machine, the resistance it provides as a war machine. So the paper seeks to discuss the idea of war machine, the nature of relationship between state apparatus and war machine as assemblages, the role of desire, its apparent relationship with fascism and war. Also, through employing the concept of rhizome, I particularly try to understand how multiplicities exist and the different lines of territorialization, and to use this to try and understand the ongoing farmers' protest in India as a war machine. So I'd begin this by asking, what is a war machine? So in 1,000 Plato's Deleuze and Guattari brings in war, state apparatus, and war machines. These are assemblages in themselves, as no assemblages are entirely pure. They are organized on Deleuze, borrowing on Nietzschean schema of drives and impulses as being the deciding machine. And both of them agree in saying that desires or drives are never free, and they're always arranged or assembled in social formations. These social formations being the state, the market, war machines, etc. The expression of this desire can be interiorized or exteriorized. The interiorization of the desire leads to the formation of hierarchy like state, and the exteriorization of the desire leads to the formation of war machine. And it should be noted that the interiority and exteriority of expression of desire always coexist. Now let's move on to why are the farmers protesting in India? The farmers are protesting against the newly introduced 3 Farm Acts, the Farmers Produce and Trade and Commerce Act, Farmers Agreement on Price Assurance and Farm Services Act, and the Essential Commodities Amendment Act, which was introduced in September 2020. The protest is still ongoing, with the farmers ready to end the agitation only if the laws are repealed. Thousands of farmers have been camping at the protest sites since in the southern and eastern margins of New Delhi at 3 border points, Tikri, Singhu, and Ghazipur. So the farmers point out at the hasty passage of these acts as to how there has been hardly any discussion with relevant stakeholders, that is any farmers association, before these bills were introduced. They further believe that dismantling of agriculture market produce committee, that is the APMC mandis, under Farmers Produce and Trade Commerce Act, implicate that private corporations buy directly from farmers, and the consequent phasing out of MSP, that is minimum support price, currently offered for 24 agricultural commodities, the farmers stand to lose as their bargaining power, as nearly 70% of Indian farmers have small and marginal sized land holdings. The state, on the other hand, has defended the legislation, arguing it's pro-farmer, and these market reforms are necessary to improve their livelihoods, as it intends to help farmers by liberalizing agricultural markets, expand storage, and facilitate contract farming. The state argues that dissolution of APMC mandis will enable farmers to sell their produce wherever they want across the country at the highest price offered, and they still assure that the minimum support price offered is not being withdrawn. Furthermore, the Essential Commodities Amendment Act removes cereals, pulses, oilseeds, onions, and potatoes from the list of essential commodities. It will deregulate the production, storage, movement, and distribution of these food commodities, adding to the worry of farmers. The state, however, views the reforms as a landmark change in the Indian agricultural sector that could initiate a complete transformation of agriculture, which is expected to benefit all stakeholders, farmers, industry, and consumers. The new laws provide for greater competition and enhancing the effectiveness and efficiency of marketing sector of the agriculture domain, according to the state. Now, the farmer protests remind me of a rhizomatic display. As Deleuze explains, any social formation primarily involves lines of flight, creating the rhizome, movements of deterritorialization, which are also movements of resistance. I quote, a rhizome ceaselessly establishes connections between semiotic chains, organization of powers, and circumstances relative to art, science, and struggle. A rhizome is always connected to other things. It's like a rhizome, the protest is growing and a decentralizing multiplicity. The farmers are multiplicities which are trying to evade the centralizing tendency of the government, of the state, and moving in various directions to resist the striding forces, especially that of a hierarchical state. Like Deleuze and Guattari speak of a rhizome, this movement cannot be destroyed due to the fact that they are multiplicities, located in a smooth space, evolved through lines of flight that not only deterritorialize, but also reterritorialize. A rhizome always grows back through any one of the lines of flight, and as such, the protist remains viable. The protists evolve into a war machine in their resistance and unwillingness to be appropriated by the thought of the state. Moving on, what else makes the farmers' protest a war machine? What else makes the farmers' movement essentially a war machine apart from their rhizomatic behavior? Again, as Deleuze and Guattari explains in 1,000 Platos, it is exactly this thought that separates them. So their thought is a problem thought and not a problem-solving thought like that of the state. It appeals to the masses, but cannot be absorbed by the state. It is also the inherent nomadism in the movement that gives rise to it as a war machine. I quote, "The nomad is the one who does not depart, does not want to depart, who clings to the smooth space left by the receding forest, where the steppe or the desert advances, and who invents nomadism as a response to this challenge. The nomads are vectors of deterritorialization. They have patience, they know how to wait. The farmers' movement have exactly shown this. They have stood their ground with patience for almost a year now, showing their determination to be heard. A global pandemic did not deter them. They took the precautions necessary and continued their ground." Then, the farmers also represent the nomadic science as opposed to the state, which represent the royal sciences. What the farmers have experienced is what their science is all about, whereas what the state has can be tested, it's empirical. Moving on to, is war the aim of a war machine? So Deleuze and Guattari all throughout 1,000 Platos explain how war is necessarily not the primary and the sole aim of a war machine. In fact, it's not even the aim of a war machine. A war machine, it is capable of mutations. So war happens only when a war machine has exhausted all its capability of mutant changes. I quote here, "War does not necessarily have battle as its object, and more importantly, the war machine does not necessarily have war as its object, although war and battle may be its necessary result under certain conditions." In 1,000 Platos, one can see how Deleuze and Guattari question war as the object of war machine for the annihilation of enemy forces, but rather war machine is the invention of the nomads, resulting in war if they collide with state forces opposing their positive object. It is at this point that a war machine actually becomes war and adopts as its enemy the state and aim for its destruction. War is the hidden potential in a war machine that will be realized under the necessary circumstances. But war is external to the state. The military and the army are not war machines, but means of appropriation by the state to withstand the war machine that it might confront. About war machine and fascism. So war machines run the danger of being installed into a black hole, and a black hole is a moment of overcharged emotions and desires to escape, resulting in helplessness, leading to self-annihilation. When a war machine gets installed in a black hole, one witnesses the emergence of fascism. And what makes fascism a cause of worry is its micropolitical power. I quote, "It was this reversion of line of flight and the line of destruction that already animated the molecular forces of fascism and made them interact in a war machine instead of resonating in a state apparatus. The war machine that no longer had anything but war as its object and would rather annihilate its own servants than stop the destruction. All the other dangers paled by comparison. As Deleuze argues, a fascist state is a suicidal state awaiting its own death. Fascism turning the desire of population upon itself to a suicidal self-destruction. So how does one not give into microfascist desire being inside a war machine?" In conclusion, I like to present how the farmers' protests are remarkable in its resistance, in its resilience. It has persevered in the face of many odds. The farmers' protest, other than being a war machine, brings me to Deleuze explaining life in terms of events. Life as not only organic, but incorporating non-organic elements. It is interesting to notice how the movement have come forward as a war machine, creating a different life in itself, which has been so nurtured that it braved the extreme cold, heat, and rain for the past 1 year. Life has become a bigger event, assimilating not only the farmers in this context, but also their tractors, fields, etc. It is noticeable how the farmers began a new mode of life at the site of protest. They sleep in their tents, cook their food, their kids study there. It is a bigger event. They are not one, they are many. So I would like to conclude my presentation saying that all of us can be a war machine in our thoughts and writings, because we are not one, we are many, we are multiplicities. Thank you. So I'll stop sharing right now.
Thank you so much. So we have like 10 minutes or maybe 7 minutes of Q&A session. I'd like to thank 4 presenters for their valuable presentations. And after 7 minutes, we have to stop because the final plenary session starts in 15 minutes. So there's a question. Sibyl is saying, hi, thanks for the interesting talks from the panelists. A question to Dr. Roshni. So how do you differentiate the critical and the commentary traditions in modern Indian philosophy in light of the religious philosophy as the becoming pre-philosophical of philosophy itself? Can elaborate. So I would like to read it one more time. How do you differentiate the critical and commentary traditions in modern Indian philosophy in the light of Deleuze's philosophy as a becoming pre-philosophical of philosophy itself? Dr. Rossi?
Hi, thanks for the question. Though I'm not very sure whether I got the question in the real sense. So what I have, with respect to this paper, I will try to explain what I've been trying to do. On the one hand, the colonial philosophy that was emanating out of the colonial period was predominated by neo-Advaitic thinking, which we see in a systematized form with a bent for systematization, and that we see in the works of thinkers like Krishnachandra Bhattacharya. Now, when we come to the critical, so if I go along with the classification of that Sibyl made between critical and commentarial, now if you want to situate the commentaries that sprang out of Guru Narayana Guru's work within the critical tradition. My question was the 2 dominant commentaries on Narayana Guru's work emerged out of Muni Narayana Prasad and Nataraja Guru. So now in one work that is by Muni Narayana Prasad, he would situate the relevance or significance of Narayana Guru's work with respect to its non-polemicism, non-argumentative style of reasoning. But if you take a broader view as what was happening in the Indian philosophical scene, if you look at Swami Vivekananda's work, and Swami Vivekananda being the leading voice advancing the neo-Advaitic thinking, the non-polemicism was already inherent to the philosophical pulsations of the colonial period, for the obvious reason that the political emancipation that was the universal objective of these thinkers would be engendered by a polemicist thinking. Now I do not deny the relevance or the factor of non-polemicism doing something within the Narayana Guru's work itself. So I don't completely deny these 2 commentaries, but I was trying to situate a Deleuzian understanding of Narayana Guru in relation to these 2 commentaries that emerged out of Narayana Guru's work. So as to advance the relevance of his thought for in a futuristic framework. This is what I've been doing.
Okay.
I know this was not a very satisfactory answer, but this is as far as I could do.
I hope it resonates for Sibyl. Any further remarks, any further comments from the audience or questions? Eva.
Hello.
Good morning.
Thanks all the presenters for their really inspiring work. Yulia, Sandhya, Roshni, and Gopika. Actually, I have two short questions for today, or we can then proceed via email or so. For Gopika first, and then I'll go to Yulia. The idea of war machine is really an inspiring one, and the way you actually elaborated on it was telling. I was just wondering, how would you? Sorry,
Thank you so much, ma'am.
War machine. My question would be, do you think that you can take the idea of war machine out of the whole spectrum of machines? There are so many in the Deleuze theory. For instance, machine Dionysiac, abstract machine, and so on and so on.
Machines.
There's a whole spectrum. What do you think that the war machine, for me as well, and I got that from your presentation as well, that war machine is in a way special, and it's most important. Special. Yeah, for analysis. Just a word on that, if you may.
It's a very, very strong instrument to connect with resistances.
Yes, and it also goes along the lines, I think, of some most influential orientations in present-day philosophy, which would go against individuality, against either individual or collective or social, so-called trans-individual, like for instance, Balibar and so on. I think there are some quite topics we should relate in the very near future. Thank you very much. Another short comment, Yulia. The connection was so bad. I don't know if I may ask you a question, or perhaps.
I think it would be good. Maybe
yes, please.
Has the
yes, I was just wondering, about this desire. Somebody was saying yesterday, I think, that most of the students all around the world would actually first ask questions about identity and identities. Where in some parts of, how should I say, some parts of the world, at least in our little Slovenia, Yulia, this would actually be the catchword would actually be desire. So whenever I put desire into the title of my lecture, twice as much people would come. So I wonder, Yulia, where we should go, with the concept of desire, apart from Lacanian hardcore thinking and Deleuze theory, very thorough critique. Do you think that perhaps we should write something like to have done with judgment? To have done with desire, to have done with desire. What would you say?
Yeah.
This probably means no comment.
No, she's out from the site, so we wait for her. She's not online. She's back. Okay. Yulia, can you receive the question?
No,
did you receive the question?
I lost you. I lost Eva. I just heard identity and nothing else. Then everything was frozen.
Frozen for a while. Okay, Eva, can I
Yes,
kindly ask you to repeat one more time?
Identity seems to be a very important issue nowadays. And somebody was saying that whenever students ask a question, it's in the first place about identities. And I think that in certain parts of the world or in thinking orientations, this desire actually became more important than identity, but it's a misleading way of doing it, I think. That's why I was asking Julia, would you like to stick to the problem of desire? You know, regardless the very important and very inspiring critique of Deleuze-Guattari, anti-Oedipus and otherwise, or shall we actually make the move, the very important move, I would say, which would be parallel to Deleuze's slogan and essay and idea, to have done with judgment, to have done with that judgment in philosophy. Could we do something similar in relation to desire, to have done with desire? Or really, or not?
I don't know why we should do this. Why we should done with desire. I will, in the connection to identity, I think that identity blocks desire, because it's desire have to adapt itself to different conditions, and if you have identity, it is like more state apparatus than war machine. You can have state apparatus also in your personality, or so that's why I wouldn't connect it with identity. To done with judgments.
Actually, I was just going to say that both are not good for thinking. You know, it's identity blocks a certain way of opening up your minds, and desire actually became, because of the Lacanian overwhelming, you know, of the there. It's so vivid in and it's so around this idea of desire, and I don't know whether we should not really go beyond it. Desiring machines or something like that.
Yes.
But even further on, I would go even further on. But we can have this talk sometime in the near future. Thank you very much.
Yeah. I think that the desire is what moves something towards or away. This is a movement. It is not that we are blocked with some object. That's why.
Yeah, I'm not really puzzled by the definition of desire, but the way actually the word and the idea works in intellectual discussions nowadays. I was even thinking of perhaps proposing kind of, you know, dialogues, like dialogue between Deleuze-Guattari and Lacan, on the other hand, like those you are probably familiar with in Great Britain, in UK. They organize dialogues, which would mean Klein-Lacan dialogues, which would mean to have the point of view from Klein and to have the point of view of Lacan. And perhaps something similar should be done from now on.
Yes.
Between Deleuze-Guattari on the one hand, Lacan on the other hand. And in that context, we could see how desire is actually such a problem, I would say.
Yeah,
perhaps we shouldn't even use the word anymore. But thank you so much for letting me having this comment. Thank you. I mean,
thank you.
Nathan is also writing a small commentary. He says there is a reason Foucault expressed reservations about the use of desire. So a comment or further comment to the discussion. I'm looking for the signal from the main office, but due to my time clock here, we have to finish this non-plenary session in a minute to start the final session, plenary session. So I would like to ask, are there any quick questions or comments to the presenters? If not, then thank you so much for 4 wonderful presentations from the eminent presenters. And I would like to conclude the non-plenary session 11 in here and hand over to Manoj. Over to you.
Thanks, Eman. Thanks all the presenters, Julija, Sandhya, Gopika, and Roshni for their excellent presentation. Now we have this plenary session, the final plenary session. We are getting into the final stage, final day, final session of the conference. And soon after the final plenary, there will be a way forward session. Soon after, it will be a continuation of the same. There won't be any break, wherein which we will initiate a discussion on a specific topic, sort of a small discussion on Deleuze-Guattari in India with Professor Raghuram Raju from IIT Tirupati, who has already written a book on Deleuze-Guattari in India. So he will be the main discussant, and we expect all of you to stay back for that as well after the plenary, final plenary, and then we will have the concluding session and word of thanks. So thanks everyone, and now we will take over to the next section.